Okay, ladies, here we go with Wilson in World War I. So we're going to do chapter 29 here for the classes that are, there's one, for some reason, A-Day is behind a little bit, a whole chapter behind the other classes. I don't know, just the way it's fallen with snow days or whatever. So we're going to go ahead and do this. So basically, at the end of chapter 28, we talked about how the election of 1912, Teddy Roosevelt's going to decide to run again. He ran in 1904. Well, he finishes out McKinley's term when he gets assassinated in 1901. So then in 1904, Teddy Roosevelt runs and he wins. 1908, he could have run, but he decides not to. And he endorses Taft. Taft is going to be a one-term president. The Republicans actually choose Taft to run in 1912 and not Teddy Roosevelt. So Teddy gets upset and he creates a party on his own. It was the Progressive Party, like a progressive, a bunch of really progressive people. And he called it the Bull Moose Party. Now, he was originally a Republican, so he sort of splits the Republican vote, and it allows for Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, to come in easily. Now, Woodrow Wilson is a Democrat, different party than Taft and Roosevelt. However, if you line up their agendas side by side, they're very similar. It's not very bipartisan. It's really, they have a progressive agenda. They just happen to be different political parties. So it's not as polarizing as maybe it is today. And Wilson grew up in Virginia. He most recently is from New Jersey. He comes over after being president of Princeton University and a professor at Princeton University, which back then it was called the College of New Jersey. And he also becomes the governor of New Jersey. Then he later runs for president. So he is, living in New Jersey at the time, but he really has Southern ideals when it comes to things like race. He actually does segregate his offices in Washington when he is president. The offices where people who work for him, he has segregation, and some things go on there with that. But he has progressive ideas otherwise, but he doesn't do anything for civil rights. Neither does any president really until the 1960s. However, he does have a progressive agenda as far as trust. He wants to break up a lot of trusts. He wants to, like the monopolies, and he wants to do banking reform, and he wants to lower tariffs. And he does do all of those things. So his platform is called New Freedom. And New Freedom is exactly what I just said. Stronger antitrust laws, banking reform, and tariff reductions. He pushes for those things. Remember, we said William Howard Taft just made the tariffs get so high. He wants to lower those. And these are progressive ideals here. Okay? So he is a progressive. All right, and then Teddy Roosevelt runs in the Bull Moose Party, and he is going to run a program called New Nationalism, which is very similar to his Square Deal program that we saw in 1904. However, he's added women's suffrage to his agenda, which was very progressive for the time, even though we know that in 1920, the 19th Amendment is going to pass, so it's sort of at a fever pitch as far as the women's suffrage movement, but for a man to put that on his agenda was a big deal. So he wants also antitrust legislation and better public, we say here, girls, programs of social welfare. I also sometimes say better public health and safety. So think like the Meat Inspection Act and things like that he had done previously when he was president. This is inclusive of like better working conditions, better care for people living in urban settings and things like that. Okay, so definitely more involvement in government. Even though Woodrow Wilson is a Democrat, he's still like more hands-on and progressive. Okay, and so this cartoon is something you see a lot. You know that the elephant is a symbol for the Republican Party. So you take those Republicans, you divide them by the Bull Moose Party, and you end up with a Democrat. And that is Woodrow Wilson in office. So Teddy was really always a Republican. So when he ran on this ticket, a lot of the Republican voters went and voted for him instead of the Republicans. And that ended up splitting the vote, and it allowed Woodrow Wilson to come in with ease. He actually wins by a landslide. So I don't know if the Republicans even would have had it without dividing the party, but I think it confused a lot of people and allowed somebody else to come in. So they do split those votes. Okay. And the Progressive Party is going to eventually die out. But Teddy Roosevelt remains very vocal pretty much until he dies. He's going to die not too long after World War I. His son gets killed in World War I and becomes very broken. He becomes very brokenhearted. I think his arteries were clogged, but he had heart issues, but he was very deflated after, his son had died in World War I. Okay. So we talked about types of diplomacy, and Teddy's big stick. Taft is dollar diplomacy, and Woodrow Wilson is going to use something that we call moral diplomacy, which means holding American ideals such as democracy and justice and human dignity and things like that. He's going to hold those at a high standard for other countries. So where he sees that not being utilized, we might have something to say about it. He's not one to rush in with the military or financial things like the two preceding presidents were. But he is, they always say when Wilson runs for president again in 1916, they're going to say the pen is mightier than the sword. So he's pushing to avoid war. He's not an imperialist. He's not, ready. It's ironic that he's the one who gets involved in the Great War, World War I, and he was not one to rush to use the military, but he is actually what we call an isolationist. He doesn't want to get involved in the affairs of other nations. When you think of, Washington's farewell address and what he warns against, this would be, George Washington would be proud of Wilson for trying to stay out of World War I. He really does. World War I breaks out in 1914, and we do not join until 1917. So Woodrow Wilson does do a lot of things to try and stay out of the war. We proclaim neutrality. We remain isolationist for as long as we possibly can, and we will talk about what finally pushes him to join the war, but he has this sense that we must keep the world. He says this quote: "We must keep the world safe for democracy," and that's why he does join finally. We'll talk about the things that Germany was doing that kind of forced his hand, but he wants to uphold these ideals. He feels that other people in other countries should be able to live freely, trade freely, do all the things that we do in America. And when people aren't doing that, then maybe he's going to intervene. Okay, and he's just his personality. He's an academic. He's very smart. He's unbending, and that's going to kind of be a pain toward the end of the war when he's negotiating peace with the world. And he really, if it's not his way, he's not into compromise. So when he comes back from negotiating the end of the war and Congress doesn't want to accept the Treaty of Versailles, instead of negotiating on it, he just kind of doesn't, we just never accept it. We never joined the League of Nations, and we'll talk about, things he could have done, but he just has a high sense of moral righteousness, and he knows he's very smart, and he knows that he has good ideas, but when people don't accept them, instead of negotiating, he just sort of shuts down. Okay. So what he does do that's very good is, I just said that Woodrow Wilson had an agenda of three things: lowering tariffs and breaking up trusts and banking reform. He does all three. So he does do what he says he's going to do. What he sets out to do, and he calls those three things the triple wall of privilege. So again, he's he's a progressive, so he's looking out for just, the average consumer. Remember the 3 C's that Teddy Roosevelt had. All the progressives were looking out for the consumer. They were looking, high tariffs hurt the consumer. High tariffs benefit the wealthy manufacturers. So Woodrow Wilson is looking out for the regular guy. Banking, everyday people need to be able to trust the banking system. He breaks up the money trust, the banking trust. Think of, with JP Morgan, banking was an industry like anything else. And, that needed to be addressed as well. So by creating the Federal Reserve Bank, he also creates a lot more stability, for Americans to have a solid banking system. And then, so those three things are very progressive things. This is also something you could include in your LEQ. Okay, so what he creates is what we call the Underwood Tariff Bill. That's probably just named after the guy who wrote the bill. And it lowers tariffs to a rate lower than they had been in 50 years. So this is really pleasing to the public. Also, too, that 16th Amendment, remember we said that you have to include the amendments in if you're ever writing an essay and it's asking you to measure what the federal government did about something, and there were amendments passed during that time period, you have to mention them because they're really hard to get put through. Remember, way back when, who started talking about this? The populists. This is one of those things. This could be a connection to another time period. The populists have been talking about the 16th Amendment. Well, they weren't calling it that then. They were talking about a graduated income tax for a long time because it would help the farmers if the wage earners were paying a tax to the government, make the government stronger, and therefore the government maybe could intervene more with things like the railroad and stuff like that. So they were in favor of an income tax, and at the time, Congress ruled it unconstitutional. So this is what I mean when I say the populists get the ball rolling on reform, but a lot of the stuff that they start doesn't come to fruition until the progressive era. And some people contend that the progressive movement is a more organized movement, a movement with a different class of people than the very rural provincial movement that the populist movement was. This one is maybe a little bit more, the middle class, a little bit different, and maybe it got more clout or more recognition, but these guys were able to put the 16th Amendment through. And Congress, it was then constitutional to collect an income tax. Sorry for this weird vision, but I'm trying to see my time here. Okay, and that's just Woodrow Wilson and Andrew Carnegie, because Carnegie was probably giving a commencement speech, at Princeton. Okay, the other big thing. Okay, girls, probably the biggest legacy of Woodrow Wilson is the Federal Reserve Bank. I think if you go to Washington, D.C., in front of the Federal Reserve Bank is a statue of Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson had the idea to create a bank that there's one central one in Washington, D.C., and that's where the head of the Federal Reserve Bank is, and there's a board of people that sit on the Federal Reserve Board, and they really monitor the economy and control the economy in this country. And then around the country, there are 12 branches of the Federal Reserve Bank. And basically, the key word is reserve. The role of the Federal Reserve Bank is to back up the other banks in the country, the commercial banks. So say like TD Bank was struggling and ready to go out of business, instead of folding up and having all the depositors lose their deposits, they would go to the national branch. So if there is a Philadelphia branch of the Federal Reserve, and say, hey, we're struggling, can you help us so we don't lose all of our deposits? Can you give us some reserve notes until we figure out what to do? So the Federal Reserve banking system is very efficient. I will tell you it fails in 1929 with the Great Depression and the stock market crash and everything like that, because the Federal Reserve Bank was the only mechanism in place to really monitor the economy. We didn't have the Stock Exchange Commission. The Securities Exchange Commission, rather. We didn't have some other things. They're put in place after the the Great Depression with the New Deal. I feel like I keep saying that, but it's true. So they were the only game in town, and they were trying to monitor a million things, and they didn't prevent the banks from failing with the Great Depression. But that's a unique situation, and they really didn't realize their power. They were so new. They're only created in 1913, and the Great Depression is only happening in 1929. So we'll talk about that more when we get to the Great Depression, but since then, after that, the Federal Reserve banking system has been intact since then. So it's probably the most impactful thing that Woodrow Wilson did, especially economically. Okay, and here's just a cartoon of him kind of reading the riot act to the banking trust. So banking was a business like anything else, and there were trusts there too. Another good thing he does, another good thing you can put in your paper, is he creates the Federal Trade Commission, which is an agency that's still around today that protects against false advertising. That was a big problem during this time period. People were making like claims that certain elixirs or potions could cure you. When you looked a little closer, those things were like, colas or beer or some kind of alcohol, and they were trying to say it was like a cure-all, whatever, making false claims. So anyway, we're going to run out of time. I'm going to do a second piece here. So this is just part 1.